Hello, in this topic we are going to take a look at the manage invoice options in account payables fusion. The invoice options control how invoices are processed for business units with a payables invoicing business function. Invoice options are grouped into different categories, and in the current topic we are going to take a look at the invoice options related to invoice entry, invoice matching, and invoice discount. In the following topic, we will review the invoice options related to prepayments, invoice approval, interest, payment request, and self-service invoices. We will go into the application to learn more about the invoice options related to invoice entry, invoice matching, matching full option, and discount. So let's get into the application and look at this in more detail. Once you log into the Oracle, go to Tools, go down, select Setup and Maintenance from my enterprise, then select your offering as a financial, go to down, select Payables, then manage invoice options. You can change the scope, but you have to also put the scope as a business unit for the manage invoice options. Click on it. Here you can see the invoice options as established or currently set for our business unit. We will first take a look at the invoice options that have been set for the invoice entry section. On the flow of default values, some default options can be defined at both the invoice option level as well as at the supplier side level. Let's take a look at the invoice options that are defined at the invoice options level and they cannot be overridden at supplier side level. The first one is here, require invoice grouping. If you enable this option, it requires you to enter a name during invoice entry to group invoices. It can be used to make payments to all invoices in a particular invoice group. Invoices group are used, defined, and are created dynamically at the time of entry. Subsequent invoices can then be added to a newly created group. The next option is allow document category override. This option lets you override the document category that is automatically assigned to an invoice. If the Oracle General Ledger sequencing by ledger option is set to ledger all or legal entity. If the sequencing by ledger option is set to no or no sequencing, then the following applies. No document category is assigned to an invoice. You cannot set this invoice option and you cannot enter a document category for an invoice. Another option here is allow adjustment to paid invoices. This lets you cancel or add lines to paid invoices such that the paid amount remains the same. You can also unmatch an invoice from a purchase order that is not on final match status and then rematch the invoice to a different purchase order. However, you cannot adjust or change the accounting distributions. Then you will allow remit to supplier override for third-party payments. These options lets you override the remit to supply your name and address on invoice installments for suppliers with third-party relationships. Next is recalculate invoice installments. If this feature is enabled, it recalculates installment information during the invoice validation process. And the summary calculation uses the most recent applicable start date and the more favorable payment term. The most recent start date might be invoice date, terms date, or goods received date, plus the number of receipt acceptance days. If the invoice is matched to a purchase order, a more favorable payment term might be the purchase order payment term rather than the invoice payment term. The following options we will discuss and jump over to is receipt acceptance days. The receipt acceptance days, you can specify the number of days to accept the receipt. Receipt accepted dates are added to the date goods are received when installments are recalculated. Jumping over to the accounting date basis. The accounting date basis, these options set the default accounting date that is on the resulting journal entry. The available options are goods received or invoice date. If the invoice doesn't have date of goods received, then payable uses the invoice date as a default accounting date if this option is selected. Another possibility is to set the value as goods received or system date. This means that if the invoice date doesn't have a date of goods received, then payables uses the system date as a default accounting date. The other two options are pretty straightforward. You can set it to invoice date or system date. Then the final default option here is budget date basis. This sets the default budget date when you create an invoice. It is used with budgetary control to determine when to encumber the budget. The choices are accounting date, invoice date, and system date. Now we are going to take a look at those invoice options that can be overridden at the supplier side level. If a supplier side doesn't have a value, then the invoice option setting as defined here is what will be used. The first option is hold unmatched invoices. If this option is enabled, the system applies the matching required hold during invoice validation to invoices that are not matched to a purchase order or a receipt. This option can be set on supplier side to yes, no, or default from payables options. This invoice option is used only when the setting on the supplier side is set to default from payables option. Another option is invoice currency. This should be set to the functional currency of the associated business unit and ledger, but it can be set to a non-functional currency. An invoice can be entered using a different currency and can be converted to the functional currency of the associated ledger by system. You can also specify the payment currency. This should be set to the functional currency of the associated business unit and the ledger as well. And the same as the invoice currency, it can be set to a non-functional currency. You can pay invoices in any currency irrespective of the invoice currency. You can also specify a default pay group. Pay groups are defined in the Manage Payables lookups and they are used by Oracle Payments. There are some of the options available here. Next, you can also have the option to provide payment priority. Here you can set a value from 1 to 99. You can use this to prioritize which suppliers get paid first. For example, if you have 100 suppliers in the standard pay group, but you only need to pay 50 of them on a weekly basis, you can set those 50 suppliers with a priority as 1 and the rest as priority 2. A Payment runtime, you can submit payment process for the standard pay group with priority 1, and in that case only the 50 with priority 1 will be paid. You can also specify the default payment terms. You can set this to the most favorable payment term for the business unit. Yet, because payment terms are usually negotiated with each supplier, this is usually set at the supplier side. The next option is terms date basis. Payables uses this date, the payment term, and the pay date basis to calculate when the installment is due for payment. The available options are goods receive date, invoice date, invoice receive date, and system date. Next is pay date basis. Available options on this field are discount date and due date. This sets the basis for determining whether an installment is scheduled for payment using the actual due date or the discount date. If a business unit has a policy to take advantage of discounts, it should be set to discount date. So there are two more options available here. Enable invoice account coding information for coding. Enable invoice account coding workflow. So if you have a policy where the account code distributions are provided by the payables team at a later stage, and you can push the invoices to those payables users who are responsible for providing the distribution account. You can also enable the feature of prevent deletion of invoice attachments. This one is pretty self-explanatory. You want to enable it if you want to prevent the deletion of attachments for validated or approved invoices. Note that you can add additional attachments at any time, but this option only allows you to delete them. The final options we will discuss but doesn't appear here is duplicate invoice checking. You can enable it as an additional feature to find potential duplicate invoices on the combination of supplier, invoice type, invoice amount, invoice currency, and the invoice date attributes. During the invoice creation, the user gets an alert for a potential duplicate invoice being entered. This feature only checks for standard and prepayment type invoices. It doesn't check the invoice number as an attribute to identify the potential duplicate invoice, and doesn't perform a check on auto-generated invoices such as pay on receipt, pay on use, intercompany, and debit memo services. The following lookups need to be created and enabled to use this feature. Let me open Excel sheet or Notepad. Duplicate invoice checking. To lookup are add duplicate inv check and duplicate invoice check. So these lookups need to be created and enabled to use this feature for duplicate invoice checking. The first standard lookup type, this is a standard lookup type. And the second lookup still in all caps lock for duplicate invoice check. I will make a separate video to enable these features if you need to make a checking for duplicate invoices entry for the supplier. Let's come back to the applications, go to down. Now let's take a look at the available matching section on the manage invoice options page. When you match an invoice to a purchase order, the purchase order default aligns the schedules and the distributions values to the invoice. These options can only be set on manage invoice options page, and they cannot be overridden at the supplier side level. The first one is here, allow final match tip. This option lets you perform a final match when matching to a purchase order or when you are adjusting a matched invoice distribution. Final matching permanently closes a purchase order and you cannot perform any further matching to the purchase order. If a subsequent matching is tried, the invoices are placed on final matching hold. Another option here is allow matching distribution override. It lets you override invoice distribution that was created from matching an invoice to a purchase order. The third one is transfer PO distribution additional information. This option lets you transfer the descriptive field information from a purchase order distribution to an invoice distribution when you match an invoice to a purchase order. Then there are two more options available here, quantity tolerance and amount tolerances. You can specify default values for these two options on both manage invoice options and the supplier side. If the supplier side doesn't have a value, then the invoice options setting is used. The invoice must first be defined in the Manage Invoice Tolerances page and are detailed later to get an understanding how they are used. If the invoice exceeds either of the tolerances, it is placed on hold. It's not showcased here, but you also have a functionality called Match in Full. You can use the Match in Full functionality when the supplier sends an invoice for the full amount of the purchase order. Match in Full sub-elements the existing functionality of matching invoice lines to the purchase order. Keep in mind you cannot use Match and Full in certain cases. You cannot use this functionality when the invoice match option is received. When the supplier or purchase order is set for self-billing, and also when the purchase order is already partially matched to one invoice. Now we will take a look at the discount section. Go to down. So if you use payment terms that include a discount, these settings will control what is included in the calculation and how to allocate the discount. You can set the options on a supplier side to yes, no, or default from payable options. So let's take a look at each of them. First one is exclude tax from calculation. This indicates that you can exclude the tax from an invoice when the discount double amount for an installment is calculated. The next one is exclude freight from calculation. With this option, the system excludes the freight from an invoice when the discount double amount for an installment is calculated. Then there is also discount allocation method. It specifies how to distribute the discount, whether you want to have it apply on all invoice lines, by tax lines and single distribution, or by a single distribution. Another option is always take discount. So if you enable this option, it considers that you want to take the available discounts regardless of when the invoice is paid. More enhancements have been made to the system as far as discounts are concerned. They are related to early payment discounts. Oracle Payables Cloud now integrates with adaptive intelligence and supports sophisticated data science that drives the early payment discount offers. So with this feature, you can pay invoices early in return for real-time discounts. Early payments offer discounts on a real-time basis each day of the payment cycle. The earlier the payment, the greater the discount. Allowable discount decreases on a sliding scale based on the supplier description and variable annual percentage rate, with the date accelerated is used to determine the discount amount and the payment amount. For example, that discount amount is calculated by using a formula that incorporates the days paid early and the variable APR. This is different from the traditional static payment terms that uses pre-negotiated discount terms. The payment of an invoice of, for example, $10,000 when accelerated 15 days early using the APR of, for example, 40% will have a discount amount of $170 or $80. So you need to ensure that you opt in to visualize this feature. So let me show you how to check if it's enabled for early payment offers. Go up, cancel. We will click on change feature opt-in. We will look for payables, then change feature opt-in. There it is. Click on edit features, early payment offers, click on edit. Here you can see the two options, that standing offers and dynamic offers. It is also important to keep in mind that the license for adaptive intelligence is required to use this feature for early payment offers. Appreciate your comments for the first part of the manage invoice options. Appreciate also your subscriptions, and the next video we will continue the other options of manage invoice options. Thanks for watching.